It's so great to be back on our live stream talking about yet another BC Humanist Association report. I always want to start these things with like a physical copy to show off, to just like beat our listeners over the head with, as it were. But we never print them, right? We always get digital copies. So
It's funny, I got a news notification, Ian, for one of our very rare publications that came out in paper form. It was that book chapter we did on unconstitutional prayer in the BC legislature. And it was like, oh, we get to touch our report. And the whole like highlight was getting to touch your physical report. Now, this is the challenge with doing like good quality gray literature. It's a digital PDF, which you can't stack on a shelf, unfortunately.
yeah, so introductions. I'm Ian Bushfield, Executive Director of the BC Humanist Association.
And I'm Teale Phelps Bondaroff. I'm the research coordinator for the BC Humanist Association. And for the past, well, several years, Ian, we've been working on the Saguenay project. And that's what today's live stream is about. It's about unconstitutional prayer in municipal council meetings across Canada. And thank you for joining us, those of you who are here and those of you who are joining us later. We are going to be taking live questions. So if you have any questions at any point during our live stream, please put them in the box. We'd love to answer those questions and talk about this topic. Ian, I think you did the math. It was over 800 pages on the topic of unconstitutional prayer in municipal council meetings in Canada. So we know what we're talking about, or we'd like to think we do, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, and it keeps adding up with each new report. As you mentioned, the Saguenay Project, we've been looking at prayers province by province, starting here in British Columbia, where we really cut our teeth on understanding the issue, but then we had such a fantastic volunteer team that we've managed to expand that data set nationwide. And today we're talking about the farthest side of the nation, Prince Edward Island. Uh, I don't know, there's a little kinship, I feel like, between BC and PEI being on opposite ends, especially for you. You're coming from Vancouver Island, and
It
PEI
also
is
makes me
on.
chuckle a little bit. So when I'm not doing work at the BC Humanist, I'm also a city councillor in the district of Saanich, and we have more residents than the entire province of PEI. So I have a lot of solidarity with some of the folks thinking, okay, well, they have a premier who's handling emails from a similar number of constituents, and we don't. So it's nice to have like staff for those kinds of things, which we don't get. But no, it's a little bit of island solidarity for sure.
So the top line results from this report is we did look at the 15 municipalities with at least 1,000 people in it as of the 2021 census. And from all of those, we looked at a lot of data. We went before the Saguenay decision with regular council meetings. We looked at inaugural or swearing in ceremonies, and we'll get into some nuance there, all the way up until today. And we only found one prayer in that decade of research.
Which is great news, right? Like this is we've been surveying across the entire country and the numbers have fluctuated considerably. So the project started here in British Columbia, going back to the 2018 municipal elections, and we found 26 cases of unconstitutional prayer in those elections. And because we're the BC Humanists, we focused on BC, of course. We've done 3 reports there now. The second report found 7 municipalities that had unconstitutional prayer in their inaugural meetings. And the most recent report, we declared BC unconstitutional prayer free, largely thanks to our hard advocacy work. And I think it might be worth breaking down some of the terms we're going to be using as we're talking about these topics. I realize we talk about inaugural meetings and unconstitutional prayer. What does all that mean? So maybe before we talk about PEI, we break down some of the terminology and exactly what we're talking about. I might just start us off by saying municipal council meetings, there's different types, right? There's committee meetings, there's inaugural meetings, there's regular council meetings and committees of the whole, et cetera, et cetera. We generally categorize municipal council meetings into 2 different categories: regular council meetings and inaugural council meetings. Inaugural council meetings are the meetings that tend to follow an election where newly elected municipal council members are sworn in. Although we did have some issues with this in PEI, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. Regular council meetings are your typical weekly or monthly meeting, depending on the schedule of a municipality. And what was interesting in these, when we looked at this issue in British Columbia, is we found that inaugural meetings tend to have more pomp and circumstance and ceremonial elements. And as a result, they were more likely to have prayer. All 26 cases in British Columbia were at inaugural meetings, and we didn't find any in regular council meetings. So that's kind of the background on like meeting types. But the reason why we're talking about this in the first place is largely goes back to the Saguenay decision by the Supreme Court. Maybe we should talk a bit about that before we start focusing on our lovely friends from PEI.
Yeah, it's been 10 years since the decision was rendered in April 2015. We actually released our latest report on BC Prayer Free BC on the anniversary of that decision, which we declared Religious Neutrality Day.
A new
And
holiday, friends. Mark your calendars. That's an important one to mark down. It's a new national holiday which we've created and we'll be celebrating here forthwith.
yeah, that's one where I actually do have the physical proclamation from the city of Vancouver. I don't remember where I put it right now.
I
It's
was gonna say
somewhere
you have to have
on my
like on
desk.
the
I
wall, you
could,
can gesture towards it, right?
I have framed those in the past, and I'll probably get this one framed.
I
But
love it.
yeah,
Obviously,
we
it was gonna
got
win.
Vancouver. I think we got Ottawa and Toronto, or one other, to proclaim Religious Neutrality Day for April 15th, and we'll be trying again in the new year. But the Saguenay decision started, the effort of that started about a decade earlier when this man, Alain Simoneau, a resident of the city of Saguenay, Quebec, went to his council meeting and didn't like that the mayor of that town was opening every meeting with a overtly Christian Catholic prayer, including crossing himself, and just really playing up the religiosity of that community. So he filed complaints through the Quebec Human Rights Commission, got support from a prominent group, the movement like Québécois, and it wound its way through the courts, eventually landing on the Supreme Court of Canada's desk.
And so then it wasn't decided until 2015. So it's 2006 was the original complaint. There was a lot of back and forth. If you're interested in taking a deep dive, it's all, of course, in the court records. And it's a fascinating process. And you kind of learn a bit more about how this process works. But ultimately, in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to include prayer in a municipal council meeting. And these some really strong language. We've been using this court. I think you and I have read this court case more than probably most. And there's some really important elements. One of the elements is that it establishes the state's duty of religious neutrality. So a lot of folks may be familiar with the concept of separation of religion and government or church and state, depending on, it's an American concept heavily. Sorry, it's not an American concept. It's a concept that is heavily promoted in sort of the American political scene, despite what's happening in that country sometimes. And in Canada, the courts have interpreted that as a duty of religious neutrality. And they described true neutrality as a situation where the state abstains from taking a position on something. And this is really important as it establishes how the state should react when it comes to engaging with religion. And the court says you must be neutral, and that means neither favoring nor disfavoring. And of course, the problem of including prayer in a municipal council meeting is you're necessarily favoring one religion over other religions or religion over non-religion, and that violates the state's duty of religious neutrality. And the Supreme Court was really clear. It underscored this as a democratic imperative. And I can speak from personal experience here, Ian. Like, I've been a city councilor now for almost a full term, and we see people we want to encourage people to come and talk to our municipal council meetings. We have open mics, we have town halls, we have the opportunity for people to share their views on individual projects, on broader plans, etc. And when people come and present in front of council, they're often very nervous. It might be the only time you present in a formal setting. Public speaking is the largest fear for many people. And here you are being live streamed in your community with a room full of people who are upset about a specific local issue. And that can be a very intimidating situation. Now imagine you're walking into that and it's opening with the endorsement of a different religion. That's making you feel like a guest in that space when everyone should feel welcome. And of course, that's not the scene that we want. So effectively, for the state to be truly neutral, it has to abstain from these issues, and that's why it's a democratic imperative. It otherwise discourages public participation, and we obviously don't want that. So the Supreme Court was very clear in Saguenay, and effectively means that every municipality across Canada should be following the law. The law says you cannot open your meeting or include in your meeting religious prayer.
Yeah, the decision's fascinating, right? Because it didn't break a lot of new legal ground. A lot of these things had been in Canadian jurisprudence going back to the late 1980s. The Big M drug mart case was kind of the first case
Mm.
of religion versus government in Canada when a pharmacy in Alberta said, we want to be open on Sundays, and there's a law that says we can't. And the court ultimately said that law doesn't have a secular purpose and therefore cannot stand. And that's been Canadian jurisprudence for 40 years, pretty much.
Yeah.
And what Saguenay does, though, is really brings in all of the different arguments and knocks them down one at a time. So it brings up that people say, well, the charter opens with, we recognize the supremacy of God and rule of law. And it goes to political philosophy and says that's a theory of government. It cannot be used to undermine the actual text. It's the preamble. It's extraneous. People brought up that, well, what if you had a non-denominational inclusive prayer? And they even point out in Saguenay they tried that. They changed their Christian prayer to something less overtly Christian, kind of ecumenical, and said, no, even that can still discriminate and exclude the non-believers and the atheists in the audience.
That was paragraph 137. I have the wording here because this is a critical one. It says, even if a religious practice engaged in by the state is inclusive, it may nevertheless exclude non-believers. And I think that's a really important distinction, right? And the point that you just made, which is it's impossible to have a truly inclusive prayer, right? Like you and I have literally written an article on this topic, and a lot of people think, no, it's totally fine. You can have an ecumenical prayer, but quite frankly, no, you just can't, because if you have a prayer that prays to a single God, then necessarily excludes people from polytheistic religions. And if you have a public prayer, it excludes people whose faith traditions don't believe in public prayer, which is a lot of religions, in fact. And similarly, if you have a specifically worded prayer, for example, some faith traditions don't believe that you can actually ask a God to do things. You can't ask a God to intervene. That's seen as inappropriate. So anytime you have a petitionary prayer, that excludes those people. And so, yeah, basically, it's just not possible. And assuming that you could have a prayer that included all the different faith traditions of humanity, that would still exclude non-believers. And in fact, including such a prayer and going through such a difficult process to identify that perfect ecumenical prayer would again be favoring religion over non-religion, which would violate the state's duty of religious neutrality. And so we even saw this in Vancouver, which they tried this out. They tried to include prayers from five different faith groups. It was like, oh no, we'll be super ecumenical. We'll have a Christian, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, a Muslim, and a Sikh.
It's the start of a bad joke.
It is, yeah. Or the start of a bad way to start off a term on council, effectively, because what you have is you're now prioritizing those five faith traditions over others. And how does the state choose, right? Like, why those five faith traditions, not others? If you look at that list, it's not based on the census because they've forgotten Buddhists, for example. And you only have two sects of Christianity. But then you also have what we talked about in our report on that, which was Abrahamic hegemony, where you have most of those faith traditions are Abrahamic faith traditions, except for the six. And so you're forgetting a bunch of other faith traditions. And so ultimately, the state just isn't in a position to adjudicate these things. It should remain neutral, which means just abstaining entirely. And that's what Saguenay said.
And these are two things we really have built on as the BC Humanist Association. I'm eager to get back to our report and dive into PEI, but I want to just highlight that Saguenay is a living decision for us. It's one that we're eager to build off of in our recent submissions to the Supreme Court of Canada, which were filed just a couple of weeks ago in the case of English Montreal School Board versus Quebec. It's the Bill 21 case, the Can Quebec ban religious symbols on public employees? They invoked the notwithstanding clause to say you can't find this to be discriminatory under religious freedom. And we looked at Saguenay and said, this court has elevated the state's duty of religious neutrality from something that is built and derived from religious freedom to essentially an unwritten principle of the Constitution. And this is a well-established bit of law. Democracy, equality, the rule of law are all fundamental to our Constitution, and you can't just override those because they're inconvenient. And the courts recognize those, and we're hoping they will recognize that they have basically said the state's duty of religious neutrality is in there because of how Canada has evolved into a secular nation. And then we also pointed out that, as you mentioned, trying to arbitrate what is a religion and what isn't a religion is impossible, especially when it comes to something so personal as a symbol, because someone may wear a scarf as a cultural reason, someone may wear it as a political statement in solidarity with Palestine, others may wear it for religious reasons. And for the state to come and say you can't wear it for religious reasons means they're having to either know your mind or define what a religion is, and they're not competent to do either of those.
And this gets even more complicated too, because I recall some of the writings of Laurie Beeman, who was kind of leading academic on secular issues in Canada. And in one of her books, she talks about even beyond that, let's say you could identify which religions you wanted to highlight. How do you manifest that? And what I mean by that is there's religion as it's written down in a book very often, and the practices that flow from that. And then there's folk religion, which is how people practice their own personal faith. And what Laurie was looking at was a court case in the States where there was a cemetery, and people wanted to decorate the graves with artifacts and flowers and sculptures and stuffed animals. And the cemetery had a policy of nothing can be laid on graves. And people said, well, it's our religious practice. And of course, the cemetery argued that it wasn't. Like laying flowers and stuffed animals and sculptures on grave sites isn't directly linked to any faith tradition. But these people's folk tradition, like the way that their religion manifested for them, meant that they wanted to create a small shrine for their dead loved ones. And the question is, can the state adjudicate that? Like that, is the state in a position to say, this stuffed animal in a grave is a religious practice, this isn't. And it's kind of weird. And we don't have a functioning definition of what constitutes a religion in Canada anyways. And so the whole thing is just like, maybe don't get involved. Because anytime you come up with the definition of religion in Canada, you could always find an outlier that contradicts it. It's often Buddhism and sort of non-theistic faith traditions, but there's a lot of religions out there. And, it would be un could be unconstitutional, quite frankly, but it'd be unfair for the state to say, oh, we're only going to consider things that are religions that meet our predetermined definition of religion based on the overall majoritarian faith tradition. Like basically what you often see is people saying, okay, well, let's look at Christianity, Judaism, and Buddhism and Muslim and Islam as our main religions, then try and come up with a definition based on those. But of course, you're already precluding potential faith traditions that fall outside those parameters. So the whole point is the state should remain neutral, and Saguenay was very clear on this. And what you were saying, Ian, I think just to build on that is this is both a live court decision, but it's also one that, it has applications outside the municipal context. But when it comes to municipalities, the court was incredibly clear. Like we can have a longer conversation as the implications of Saguenay as it relates to tax funding. And we will when it comes to different bills in Quebec and national legislation. But when it comes to municipalities, you can't open a municipal council meeting with prayer. Hands down, Saguenay is incredibly clear on that. So we've launched the Saguenay Project, and what it does is it looks at this phenomenon across the country. What we found back in 2018, when I first started chatting with the BC Humanists, Ian, was despite the Saguenay ruling from 2015, we had instances of municipalities in British Columbia that were opening their meetings with prayer. So we did our first initial report in British Columbia, and then we thought, well, look, what about the rest of the country? Right? Just because you have a Supreme Court ruling doesn't mean there's 100% compliance. What's the compliance like across the country? And so we've been working our way across Canada. We've got reports now, and folks can find this on our Saguenay website. We'll put a link in the video show notes afterwards. We've done reports now on Saskatchewan, Alberta, 3 on British Columbia, Ontario, Manitoba, and now, of course, we're rolling out our report on PEI. And I'm sure I'm even forgetting some more on that list there. We've done a lot. And so, yeah, the question was basically, what is compliance like across the country? And we've actually found some interesting trends. And in fact, we've named PEI our report the Island Anomaly because what we found was quite interesting was that we found very few cases of unconstitutional prayer in PEI, which is, of course, a good thing. And we want to sort of highlight those. So maybe we should dive into like how we went about
Yeah.
studying and gathering the data before we jump into the findings, Ian.
Yeah, I was just going to do a quick plug to make sure people
Oh, yeah.
share the video, like, subscribe, the usual YouTube stuff. Neither of us do a lot of YouTube, but make sure to follow our channel and share this with your friends so we can
And
get
we
more.
will do more if these are successful. We've tried to in the past to find the right platform for folks. And if you're interested in getting involved, please contact the BC Humanists. And of course, our work survives thanks to the support of our members. So please donate, like, and subscribe and all that good stuff. Our team is an amazing team of volunteers from across the province and further afield, but we do need your help to keep going.
Yes, volunteers is a fantastic plug because that's how we made this project possible. That plus past support from Canada Summer Jobs, where we had our interns and a lot of volunteers just trawl through the municipal websites of every municipality in British Columbia. Uh, Once we started looking across the province, across the country, we narrowed it down a little bit to those with more than 1,000 people because we found that municipal websites get spotty and hard to view when you actually look at those smaller communities. Um, hey, I can see the likes. We got one.
Hey, thank you so much.
And
Well,
so,
just on
yeah,
that note, like some of the websites we're looking at, and we set the threshold at 1,000 for municipalities outside of British Columbia. And that's because, like, yeah, as Ian mentioned, the websites get pretty bad. And we're talking about small, very small towns where the mayor is also the head post office worker, solidarity with postal workers, by the way, and is also someone who is running the local museum, coffee shop, and is the bus driver. So yeah, those websites are very hard to manage. So we set the threshold at 1,000. And then, yeah, what did our volunteers do, Ian? Sorry, I jumped in there.
yeah, we had them go through the minutes, the agendas of 3 random regular council meetings in recent years. We had them also try to look at municipal council meetings from before 2015 to see what the practices were then. and then to look at the inaugural meetings, those first council meetings after an election, to determine if those were done any differently. And maybe let's dive a little bit more on inaugurals because they're
Yeah.
weird and difficult,
This
right?
was different. Yeah. So the
Yeah.
typical inaugural from out here in British Columbia was after the election. There's always kind of a weird couple week period of the old council's still there, new council's kind of coming in, the sort of lame duck period, as you might call it. And then they typically will have an inaugural meeting, which will include a couple of key elements. In British Columbia, it will typically include some pomp and circumstance, so singing about Canada, the marching in of the newly elected council, often with a piper. But the main element is the swearing in of new councillors. So they'll take an oath of office, and there's often a judge involved. And then the rest, there's often like a mayor's address and a couple other elements. But what we found in British Columbia was these tend to be more ceremonial. They're only held every 4 years following an election. So sometimes the processes and procedures get recycled every 4 years, and you just pick up the script from last time and use it without really thinking through the implications. So one of our thoughts was that sometimes inaugural meetings may include prayer because staff are looking to include more ceremonial elements and because they're just repeating a script from 4 years earlier, whereas the script for the daily meetings or regular council meetings tends to be updated more often. However, on the East Coast, this wasn't always the case, was it, Ian? Like we didn't find as many inaugural meetings as we would have liked.
Yeah. On inaugurals, I mean, to really highlight that difference is Ontario, basically 50% of inaugural meetings in 2018 included a prayer versus 9 of 360 had prayers at regular meetings. And even there, one of the prayers was the mayor would read the preamble of the charter as kind of I want to say God, but I don't think I'm allowed to say God, but maybe this is my loophole
Which
prayer.
it wasn't. Yeah, we call that one stealth prayer, by the way, for folks who are following along at home. It's the cheeky ways of sneaking prayer into a meeting. The other mechanism we saw was, and I think this is usually accidental, but that we found a couple instances of groups inviting a local high school choir to sing a song. And it just happens that elections take place in October, November, and they worked in some religious winter holiday songs. And we were not sure if that was a formal part of the meeting or not. And in the case of PEI, and I think in New Brunswick as well, the elections were like right before the winter holiday sort of season.
Yeah.
And as a result, it was often unclear if it was just sort of music before the meeting started or an overt example of someone trying to smuggle religious content into the meeting.
And the other thing that made it difficult methodologically is we had initially told our volunteers to look at the first meeting after
Mm.
the election, assuming that's when the new council was sworn in and they did their inaugural ceremony. But in some municipalities, it turns out they actually delay that practice or they delay that meeting because it takes time to count the votes to allow the judicial reviews to go through. And so sometimes it's the second or third meeting after an election because there is that lame duck period before the new council gets sworn in. But what we found in PEI is it's the province that doesn't really do inaugural meetings, especially not like we see them here in BC. They have standalone swearing in ceremonies, which don't often get agendas or minutes. They're just Vancouver actually did this. They called it an inaugural ceremony, and it was held at a different venue. It was held at a big concert hall so that they could have a lot of guests there. And then after that in Vancouver, they moved to City Hall to do the first day order of business, like appointing people to committees and procedural stuff like that.
Yeah.
But almost everywhere in PEI, it was a swearing in ceremony. I think I found one case where, because this was during COVID and there were restrictions, they decided to have counselors come one at a time to swear in, and they posted a picture of each of those to their Facebook page, which is how I knew they
Yeah.
did that.
The citations for that were lots of fun as well. But yeah, so this was kind of one of the ways that our project kind of adjusts and changes based on the local circumstances. We've been learning a ton about interesting municipal practices. And friends, it is kind of fun. So some of my favorite examples in British Columbia, and I think some of these were in Ontario as well, is the mayor would share a shot of whiskey with the piper once they were piped in, which is a nice, fun tradition. A couple towns have town criers with like tricorn hats oyang their way into the meeting, which is always kind of fun. Some places will sing the national anthem. Meetings will have lots of different elements, but as you're mentioning with these swearing in meetings, they were a little bit less sort of like foregrounded in PEI. So we ended up that category. It's entirely possible that some of those meetings may have opened with prayer. We couldn't find the meetings. They weren't formally minuted or agended or or documented. What we'd have our volunteers do, these challenges notwithstanding, is they would go to the website of a municipality, as Ian mentioned, look for 3 regular council meetings from randomly selected dates. So the next meeting after March 31st, 2024, for example. And then they'd also and then they would look for the minutes, the agendas, and any audio, video, visual recordings of those meetings. And we review those for prayer. We recognize that that's a potential source of error where some places may include prayer in the meeting that's not part of the agenda. Counselors might meet beforehand and pray in a small group, or the meeting might end and then they have a prayer. Those will be missed by our method just because we're not having our volunteers watch every single meeting. That's a bit too onerous. But if it's in the agenda, minutes, or in the opening section of the video, audio, video recordings, then we would catch it. And what we then asked our volunteers to do is if they found an instance of a prayer, was to record it in a database with the person's name, their religious affiliation, their gender identity, and we would then try and transcribe the prayer when we identified it. Now, because we were doing this rigorous process, we also gathered information on territorial acknowledgements and First Nations elements. Those are also a really important element. We were just talking about Orange Shirt Day yesterday, so it's important to mention this. We treat Indigenous content as a separate category. This often comes up and folks have questions about it, and they're great questions, and we've written a lot about this one, Ian. But effectively, in some places out here in the West Coast, there's a strong tradition of opening meetings with territorial acknowledgements, which is a performative way of engaging in reconciliation. And we've noticed that the practice is kind of, if you track it going across the country, and we'll talk more about this in a little while, it kind of diminishes as you leave British Columbia. But we were interested in learning more about those processes. So if there was Indigenous content in a meeting, whether it's regular, inaugural, or a swearing-in ceremony, we'd record that and the nature of that element. And those elements could be anything from a pro forma read territorial acknowledgement to a speech by a representative of a local Indigenous community to singing, drumming, dancing, a combination of all those things, traditional welcome ceremonies, smudging, various other elements. And we always encourage these because this is an important way of engaging in reconciliation with local First Nations communities. And so we treat it as a separate category. But because we were going through the data, we gathered that information as well. And so you can see that in our reports too.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is on looking through the data, I did do a lot of the verification myself after because it was 15, so and there was so many holes that, I also poured through most municipalities' YouTube channels if they have one, their Facebooks, and anywhere else I could find evidence of the meetings and what happened at them. I know in one case I had found the Facebook Live video of their swearing in ceremony. And by the time we were ready to publish the report, Facebook had deleted all old live videos. And so I had these references in the report saying, oh, this town had a judge give this nice speech before it. And I was going to transcribe that speech. But then the video's gone. And so now it's a don't know. Because
Yeah,
we
we had
have
a
to try to make sure our work is all very well referenced so people can prove it.
And this is also a classic problem with like trying to do archival work. Like when we first start, we've been effectively doing a longitudinal study on this in British Columbia. Like we started looking back, not just 2018, but we also will look back predating Saguenay just to get a better understanding as to whether the practices were impacted by Saguenay. For example, if no one was praying in meetings before Saguenay, except for Saguenay in like 3 places in the middle of nowhere, Ontario, then that's a different conversation than if 50% of municipal council meetings after Saguenay are opening with prayer and 90% of them opened with prayer before Saguenay was implemented. So we've tried to look at that longitudinal element, but the older municipal council meetings are often archived. So we didn't have the capacity to email every municipality in a province to ask them for their minutes and agendas going back to 2014 or to 2010 or whatever. And that's there's a great study there. Anyone who's watching is interested in taking a deep dive into Supreme Court compliance. There's a lot of really cool research to be done, but it was challenging because of the archival limitations.
The other thing that was challenging is Prince Edward Island specifically played around with the number of municipalities over the course of our study. In 2018, they introduced the Municipal Government Act, which amalgamated a bunch of different municipalities. Some ceased to exist, Montague. Others amalgamated into a new municipality. Others were created from rural communities. And so we had to essentially try to track 3 different sets of, because there was another amalgamation in 2020, 3 different sets of communities where I think 12 overlap the whole time period, and there's only 13 that existed in the initial point. But this happens in more places than you expect, where over a decade, some municipalities disappear, some came up, but this was a more extreme changeover than we have usually seen.
Yeah, it wasn't Jumbo Glacier in British Columbia, the smallest municipality being disincorporated because no one lived there anymore. And that does, I mean, just respect to our volunteers and your work and our team's work on this. There's a lot of like raking through complicated municipal changes. My municipality is contemplating amalgamation with Victoria in our next election, and it's a lot to. It's helpful to see how other municipalities have processed it. It does create some challenges from a research perspective, of course.
And then the last bit of methodology is where we didn't have other data. We did do our best to reach out to city staff in a number of different places. And I think we did hear back from one or two that helped us fill in a couple gaps that we didn't otherwise have.
And we noticed this in a couple other reports as well. It's worth flagging, where sometimes staff will use a pre-formatted minute paper, minute format, and it'll include blessing or prayer, but there wasn't one scheduled in the meeting. We found this in a couple of our cases in Ontario where they just hadn't updated the form letter that they used to document the minutes. So that's always helpful to reach out and say, oh, no, no, we discontinued that practice. However, we also have our wonderful lawyer friend in Ontario reaching out to the over 78 municipalities that included prayer in their most recent inaugurals. And a lot of them, their first response is, no, 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 we don't have any prayer in our meetings. And we're like, well, we have a video and a transcription of someone opening your meeting in 2022 with a prayer. So you do. And that's often those were inaugural meetings where they weren't aware of it because it's a one-off kind of situation. So there's a lot of information to juggle with here, but we did a full review, and the good news is that PEI is kind of an anomaly insofar as we found one of the fewest, the very small percentage and a small number of municipalities, sorry, a higher percentage, but a small number of municipalities with prayer in their meetings. So shall we visit Summerside then, Ian?
Yeah, well, I was just going to quickly say, before Saguenay, we were only able to identify three municipalities that didn't have prayers in their swearing-in ceremonies in 2014, and just we couldn't find anything on the rest. We did actually find data on all but two communities on their regular council meetings in 2014-ish, and none of them had prayer. And then we come to the 2018 inaugurals, and nothing happened then. But 2022 is where we see that Summerside has the Reverend Rachel Campbell deliver from, I believe it was the local United Church, deliver a Christian prayer.
And this is like a longer prayer. We have it transcribed in the report. You can find it on page 8. And what's interesting here, and I think there's a couple elements. We can talk about this at length. And maybe it's a good time to pause, folks. If you have any questions about the stuff we've just covered, please pop those in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and support the work of the BC Humanists so we're able to continue this work. But back in Summerside, the prayer, what's interesting here is you often see this, what we call like failed ecumenicism. So you have a prayer that starts with something like, and this is the exact words in the prayer. It starts with time and space within different beliefs and understandings. There are moments when we are invited to pause and seek wisdom, to truly listen, to open our hearts and minds, to be willing to be part of the sacredness of transformation. So it starts with kind of flaky, flowery religious language, and you can see they're attempting to bring in, the Reverend here is trying to bring in some ecumenicism, where it's like, well, we all have different views and different beliefs. But of course, the prayer, skipping forward a little ways, talks about the creator God, uses overtly Christian language, and then ends with, we pray all this in Jesus' name, amen. So it's kind of, you can see these sort of ironic attempts of people being like, no, no, everyone's welcome here. All faith traditions are welcome. The people of Summerside is a diverse community in Jesus' name, amen. And we always find that a bit kind of ironic, and it kind of underscores the challenge of delivering these prayers, as we already mentioned, in a way that is inclusive. It's just not possible to do that. Even though the Reverend here did their best, it's physically not possible to do an ecumenical prayer that accommodates all faith traditions, and none critically.
Yes, Summerside is the second largest community in Prince Edward Island. We should mention that after Charlottetown, probably the most prominent municipality that people on the West Coast would know. What's also really interesting is when we found the swearing-in ceremony invitation for Summerside, it included mention that everyone would also get to see the historical Bible that has been used for every swearing-in ceremony in the community since 1877, um,
Old
which
book.
is quite a fascinating old book. I did go through and watch the video, and each councillor and mayor, as they swear their oath, places their hand on the historical Bible. And that raises a couple more questions, Teale.
It does. Well, and the challenge here, there's a couple elements, right? So the first one is, subtle coercion, right? And this goes back to things like school prayer, where if they're passing a Bible around, the heritage historical 1877 Bible with lots of significance and history behind it, as a counselor who may not be religious, you are then pressured into praying on that document, right? And you see this, like we often watch the swearing in of new MLAs here in British Columbia because we're kind of political nerds that way. And you can see which ones pray on a religious text, which ones swear in or affirm on a religious text and which ones don't. But of course, the way that you present it also kind of tips over the hand of religious hegemony, which in this case is like you can swear in a Bible or you can affirm. It doesn't give people an option to swear on other religious texts. I know there's some fun stories in the States where people have sworn in on copies of Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, or, there's been controversies of people swearing in on, English literature or other books. But of course, there's a lot of, social pressure being placed on a person to do that. And that's obviously not the situation we want to be in. But on top of that, in addition to, and Ian, as you mentioned, like this Bible wasn't just there, it was also part of the like materials given out around the swearing in ceremony. There's like leaflet with information about the historical Bible. And so that's really foregrounding the religious in a situation where not all people might be religious or not all people might be that religion. The other element that was problematic here was that that same Bible was used to swear in the junior mayor and councils. It was used at the junior mayor and council swearing in ceremony. And that's looking at our records here, it's grade 9 students from Summerside Intermediate School. So now you have young people who are being encouraged to participate in local government, which is great. I'm actually heading up to council this afternoon to meet with our youth council that I'm helping set up. It's so important to engage with youth, but now you're putting a lot of religious pressure on youth. And again, those same pressures are magnified and in fact multiplied because now we have younger people who are in a situation where they can be pressured by the school and by the city, and that's a huge problem as well. So there's a lot of issues with having a heritage Bible. There's nothing wrong with having well-maintained archives and heritage materials in those archives. The question is, which ones do you foreground? And by foregrounding their 1877 Bible, Summerside is effectively like doubling down on violating separation of religious neutrality.
Yeah, and if you look at the census, which we can debate the quality of the question of the census, but it's a pretty standard stat that roughly two-thirds, 66% of Summerside residents identify themselves as Christian in the 2021 census. But that means you have over a third, 34.1%, who say they're no religion or another religion. But even within those Christians, they're not all going to be in agreement about belief in that specific translation. I know there's a lot of different translations of the Bible, some preferred by Catholics, and then all the different Protestant denominations will have their own. I don't know which exact translation the historical Bible is in Summerside, but someone's not going to like it as much as maybe there's a Christian there who prefers, it's got to be in the original Greek or it's nothing.
Or at the Asimov Bible or a red letter Bible, or I mean, I always chuckle. I have about 14 different versions of the Bible here. You got the Old Testament, the New Testament, there's 1,700 different translations. And again, yeah, that's going to exclude different members of different religious traditions. So the fact that you have historical documents like that, like there's no denying that that's been a document that's been held by the town of Summerside since, well, 1877. But it doesn't need to be something that you foreground at your inaugural meeting. These are meetings where you're ceremonial swearing in. These are meetings that are heavy with ceremonial purpose. And the choices that we make send signals to the community. And in this case, a signal is saying that we are favoring one religion over others and religion over non-religion. And that's a problem. There's something else I wanted to just backtrack a little bit here, Ian, which was the
Well, no, the
wording of the
historical
prayer.
Bible, as Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones so eloquently put, it belongs in a museum.
There you go. That's even better. I just wanted to return to the prayer from Rachel Campbell. Yeah, she is a United Church pastor. And there's one other element I forgot to mention when we were going through it, which was the language she uses implies group sentiment. So if you look at the transcription we have in our report, at one point it says, "Let us pray," and "Let's pray together. Join me in prayer." And when you see language like this, what you see someone doing is they're implying group sentiment. Like we pray to a God implies group sentiment. It's not I'm praying to a God, it's we are praying together. All of us together are participating in this action. And when someone asks someone to join them in prayer, you're again putting pressure on people to participate in a religious practice. Now, what often comes up here is people will object and they'll say something like, no, 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 no. Just because we're asking kids to pray in school, the kids that aren't religious can either not participate or leave the room. But that forces someone to identify themselves as non-religious, and it puts them in a very difficult situation. We might be big city atheists over here, but if someone's in a small town and they're the only out atheist, or they're not out, they're the only seemingly non-religious person in that town, do we want to ask them to like recuse themselves for the opening of that meeting? That's not appropriate. That puts unnecessary social pressure on them. And this was a question that was resolved with a lot of the Supreme Court rulings around school prayer. And I don't know if you could speak to that at all, Ian, because you've hit that literature quite heavily, I think.
Yeah, I know the Zilberberg case that was in
Absolutely.
Ontario, where you had a number of non-Christian students complaining about school prayer, and the school's option was, well, you can, raise your hand and sit in the hall for that section, or you don't have to stand for it. The court said, this is discriminatory. This is ostracizing because it's making the non-Christian students identify themselves. In that case, I think it was a Jewish student who led it, or their family, but there were non-religious students supporting that as well, and possibly a Muslim student as well. And having them, single themselves out in this climate now, especially, is so problematic. So,
This came up in Saguenay too, Ian, like where basically like the mayor was like, well, just don't show up for the first part of the prayer, show up late. It's like, no, that's not okay. That's not an accommodation that is acceptable in this situation because you're requiring someone to out themselves, to jump through hoops, or take extra measures to identify themselves, or not, and therefore they have to sit there and participate in a practice they may not support.
it's
One of
actually
my
a real
favorite.
problem in the UK House of Commons because they don't have enough seats for MPs. And so if you want to be able to sit and get a good spot, they don't have a fixed seating plan like our House of Commons. You have to be there early for the
Mm.
and sit through the prayer.
That's a good point. I was going to build on that too, where often this is where people might object and say, well, you're discriminating against religious people by excluding prayer. And this is another aspect that was covered by Saguenay, which is no, removing a privilege is not discriminating against someone who's previously privileged. It's, leveling the playing field. And that the question that was asked in Saguenay was the opposite of prayer is not no prayer. The opposite of prayer would be opening every meeting with the overt denial that there was a God or gods. And I always like this example as a way of really illustrating where the harm is and how including municipal prayer excludes people. It's imagine if you're a person of religion who's watching this, imagine that every meeting started with the overt declaration that your God didn't exist and that your God was wrong. If that would make you feel uncomfortable and less welcome in that setting, now just you can now imagine how people of other faith traditions feel, or non-religious people, which is basically every meeting starts with the overt denial that their personal beliefs don't exist. So that's kind
You're,
of
you're
where.
making me realize we should have started this live stream off with the denial of the existence of God.
That's right. Take a moment. Yeah.
We didn't do territorial acknowledgement for this. Um, we can, but my thinking is sort of coming around in some discussions we're having that we're not physically using the land in this case. And so I can recognize that I am on the Coquitlam territories here, but I'm not using anything from them, at least, so I don't need to ask permission, though it can still be kind and important to remember that. And also that God doesn't exist.
Well, all right, exactly. And then, I mean, just building on that too, we have another, for people who are interested, we have a report coming out quite soon exploring the history of territorial acknowledgements and the context here on the West Coast. I'm in the traditional territories of the the Sanchotan speaking people. And those folks, traditional territorial acknowledgements are a core element of their protocols, but that's not the case always, of course, across the entire country. But yeah, the idea of doing a digital territorial acknowledgement is often a bit strange because you're operating in a digital space. It's a good point to note. So we've talked a bit about some of the harms of the prayers, and we've talked about how they can exclude people. Is there anything else you want to mention about the specific case of Summerside before we kind of contextualize PEI in the broader, in the broader national context?
I think the only thing I'll note is that for swearing-in ceremonies, we only had data on 6 municipalities in 2022. We don't know what Summerside did in 2018 or prior. So it seems likely, given they had the historical Bible, they were probably doing this since 1877. Um,
Yeah.
and similarly, uh, for 2018, for example, we only had data from 4 municipalities. So it was very spotty data on these swearing-in ceremonies or inaugurals. But after that, the regulars, we have quite a lot. And it was quite interesting, right, to see the lack of religious practices at regular meetings. this is something we saw in BC. We haven't actually ever found an example of a regular meeting in BC opening with prayer. It was only inaugurals here. But every other province we've looked at, there's always a few, right? There was a couple in Alberta, there was, four or so in Manitoba, nine in Ontario, as I mentioned before, usually smaller communities. Um, but when we look at PEI, it is a pretty religiously homogenous community. It has a lot of smaller towns. I think we were both expecting to find more.
Mhm. And I think one of the interesting things there, and this is a hypothesis we worked out in the report, was that smaller, more homogenous communities may see a less of a need to reinforce community beliefs through the inclusion of prayer. So we don't need to open our meeting with prayer because we all belong, seemingly think we belong to the same faith tradition. That's obviously a hypothesis that needs to be supported with stronger data, but it is a decent explanation, I think. Some of the reasons why some of the smaller municipalities in various places continue the practice. Sometimes it's because the mayor or council wants to continue the practice. Like we had some quotes from mayors after Saguenay saying, well, I'm going to keep doing prayer no matter what. And that's not going to be the case. They will be hearing from lawyers if they do. And in other cases, they just didn't know, right? Like a few years after Saguenay, it's entirely possible that a small, village in northern Ontario just didn't get the memo, even though a memo was actually circulated, and just didn't bother incorporating into their practices, or there's new staff or whatever. Now that it's been over a decade since Saguenay was decided, it's a little less compelling to say that you weren't aware of it. Also, most municipalities have received correspondence from us on this matter, so there's really little excuse to for them to say that they weren't engaged. What's interesting on this too, and this is maybe more of our strategy here, is now that we have the Saguenay decision, what we've done is we've taken on the role of ensuring that compliance continues. So the BC Humanist Association has been incredibly effective with our advocacy on this front. In British Columbia, we got the number from 27 to 0, and that's not just overnight. It's not just us putting out reports. These reports come with letters. They come with whether it's from us, from our lawyers, our amazing pro bono lawyers, from our volunteers and members. But also, we do a lot of advocacy work publicly. So, raising awareness of these issues and the media attention that these reports can sometimes attract helps remind municipalities to step up and follow along. My favorite example is Terrace here in British Columbia. When we emailed them about prayer in their meeting, they apologized, they canceled the practice. And then a couple weeks later, I believe, they emailed us saying, so we probably also shouldn't have a nativity scene on the roof of City Hall either, right? And we're like, no, that's good. Thank you. We didn't know you had one, but please don't do that. So it's part of an ongoing learning process. There's one other thing I wanted to mention for Summerside, Ian, which was on gender, which was in most places we found a disproportionate number of people who are delivering the prayers when we do find them are men or people who identify as male. And so, for example, in British Columbia, when we looked at our last cases from 2018, I think the number was 73.9% of people delivering prayers were men. And in PEI, since it was just one person, obviously it's kind of hard to do the stats on that, but it was one woman. So that was kind of an interesting practice. And I think this also reinforces some of the, traditional gender roles within conventional religious practices. And it's something to be aware of too. If a community is trying to be inclusive, not only are they excluding people of other faith traditions, but they may also be excluding people of different gender expressions by the nature of the people who they're inviting to deliver prayer.
Should we move on to Indigenous content that we
Yes,
found?
let's. Yeah. So this one, we've kind of already foreshadowed this a little bit, but as we mentioned earlier, we were interested in looking at this because we're doing the data gathering anyways. As we mentioned, Indigenous content can be a really performative but important way of but furthering the goal of reconciliation. We definitely want to underscore that it's performative. We want to make sure that these actions are also supported with what my Indigenous friends often called reconciliation. So people are actually doing stuff. It's not just performative and saying the words, it's doing the thing. But we also wanted to understand how this practice has been growing. And we found some interesting things, Ian, as far as the breakdown. We've noticed that the
Mhm.
practice is much stronger in British Columbia. There's a longer history here, and there's arguably the origins of the practice are here in British Columbia. But what do we see when we look across
It,
for PEI and across the
it's
country?
pretty strong in PEI as well. So we have data, as I mentioned, from six swearing-in ceremonies in 2022. Interestingly, the two largest communities, Charlottetown and Summerside, both included uh, welcomes from the same person, Julie Pellissier Lush, who is the PEI Indigenous poet in residence, I believe, as well as a local elder. And in Charlottetown, she is described as giving the Indigenous prayer, and in Summerside, it was the invocation slash blessing.
This is interesting too, right? Because like what you title a thing impacts what the person does. We often say that people color within the lines. So our recommendation here is typically, yes, please include Indigenous content in your meeting. Please reach out to your local Indigenous communities and ask them what is the appropriate way of opening a formal meeting in their, using their protocols and cultural traditions, and then do that thing. What we found is you ask someone to come to a meeting to deliver a prayer, they'll deliver a prayer. If you ask someone to come to a meeting to deliver a blessing, they'll deliver a blessing. And often that will be formatted in a way that most people would recognize as a prayer or blessing. And that typically follows, hegemonic religious traditions. But Indigenous content can vary considerably. It can be a speech, it can be drumming, it can be singing, it can be dancing, it can be a combination of all of those things, it can be smudging. And so we wanted to encourage municipalities to include these elements in their meetings, but also critically not to be prescriptive in how they invited people. If the agenda item says blessing, people are expecting a blessing, and they're going to appreciate religious undertones there, as opposed to Indigenous welcome is a bit more broad and it allows for people to do what is culturally appropriate in that kind of space.
And even more interestingly, I think when we looked at regular council meetings, 8 of 14, because we couldn't find data for one municipality, I think it was a new one who only had a Facebook presence, no website for some reason. But 8 of 14 included a territorial acknowledgement at the start of every regular meeting, which makes it the most common province for that to happen aside from BC. So BC is about 70% open with the territorial acknowledgement, and PEI is about 57%. So you're
And
more
that
like
number's been
one
tracking
to
up
one.
too, which is noteworthy. The practice is growing across the country. But you're right, this is why it's the island anomaly, because what we've noticed is the practice kind of is BC heavy and kind of peters out as you leave British Columbia and move further away from the Rockies, and then PEI kind of springs up, which is very promising. Note, it's worth noting that we're still looking at New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Quebec. So those are still some outliers we haven't had a chance to look at, but it was nice to see that practice being done.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the strength of advocacy coming from, you know, allies and the Micmac community in PEI and moving that forward. I know there's a lot of interesting conversations there. One of the weaknesses of this report, frankly, is neither of us have a ton of political insight or experience in Atlantic Canada or PEI specifically. Like I know a few people from there, but I haven't spent time there, and so we can kind of only have a cursory from afar glance at this, and we can speculate around a lot of what's happening here, but I think it's kind of our hope that people can take this and fill in the gaps in the understanding and start to explain what is it about PEI that means they don't want to start regular meetings with prayer, but they are excited to include territorial acknowledgements across the province.
And this, I think, like one thing I will say, because like, there's some really cool political science that can be done on this, but also for people who are out there watching and who are interested, a lot of this can start with just one person. Like Alain Simoneau in 2006 didn't like his meeting starting with prayer, and here we are now, over a decade later, looking at all the impact that's had across the country, and it's been really impactful. So, for example, if your municipal council meeting isn't opening with a territorial acknowledgement, reach out to your councilors and mayor and staff and say, hey, can we do this practice? Or can you reach out to your local Indigenous communities and ask them what would be an appropriate way of opening the meeting? And similarly, if you find an instance of a municipality opening their meetings with prayer, please let us know because our net is very finely meshed, but every so often things slip through. We want to make sure there isn't any backsliding. One example here would be Vancouver, which didn't have prayer for years. And then in the most recent 2022 inaugurals included prayer very suddenly. And it was largely, we believe, at the insistence and direction of the mayor. And so a lot of times the individual new incoming mayor has a lot of say in how these meetings are structured. And as a result, if it's your local town, pay attention. Local politics is critical in that respect. And a couple emails from residents make a huge difference. Believe me, I know my inbox is full of them.
And I think the only other thing to mention about PEI is its legislature opens every sitting
Mm.
with a prayer, but not just one prayer, three prayers. They have the speaker read uh, two different Christian prayers, I believe, or no, they have three prayers. It's a prayer to the province, to for the king, and for the governor general or the lieutenant governor of the province. Sorry, and then they do the Lord's Prayer after that. So they just have a lot of prayer before they start business every day.
And people are interested. We have a full report on this that surveys prayer in legislatures. It's very much worth noting that the Saguenay decision applies to municipal council meetings, but does not apply to provincial legislatures and Parliament. Parliament still opens its daily sessions with a prayer. In British Columbia, sessions are opened with a prayer delivered by an MLA of their choosing. So it's kind of all over the place. We have more reports coming out on that. And then different provinces have different practices. And we've done a detailed report on this. But the reason why Saguenay does not necessarily apply to provincial legislatures and Parliament, and this is, again, I think something that needs to be tested in the courts again, is allegedly parliamentary privilege. That's what the court, basically in Saguenay, they said this applies to municipalities. We're not going to comment about provincial legislatures or territorial legislatures for those because there's other factors in play, namely parliamentary privilege. Personally, I'm of the belief that parliamentary privilege does not shield parliamentarians from discriminatory practices. And there was a lower court ruling in Ontario somewhere that has similar belief, which is effectively parliamentary privilege only goes so far. But if a parliament had a policy that said like women aren't allowed to speak or members of a certain ethnic group are prohibited from entering the room, that would not be covered or protected by parliamentary privilege. So we're building up probably for a court case in the future around that. And what we found is it's more challenging to adjust parliamentary practices. We may need to use the courts as opposed to sort of public pressure. But there's that. It's worth noting that the reason why legislatures continue to open with prayer is because that hasn't been tested at the Supreme Court just yet.
So if there are any questions, we're coming up on our hour. Please put them in the chat now so we have time to get to them before we close off today's live stream. Let's have some closing thoughts, Teale. PEI was a fascinating province to study, a smaller one, really easy to get a handle on the, 15 municipalities that were there with some caveats around how that changed over time. Incredible to find so little, like incredibly good to find so little to call out, frankly.
It's reassuring. Like one thing I wanted to make sure we covered was like the full, ambit of Saguenay, our project, the Saguenay project. And people, please you'll find a link in the description of the video afterwards. And we've gone through all the provinces, and PEI was very much an outlier. Just to run through the numbers very briefly, and please put those questions in the comments, friends. Like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, of course. When you look at other provinces, so for example, Saskatchewan, our previous recent report, we found 3 out of 90 municipalities had prayer in their inaugurals. 2 out of 95 had them in their regular council meetings. For Alberta, it was 6 out of 172. A lot of people find that surprising for inaugural meetings in Alberta. They suspect that Alberta is a bit more religious, and there's definitely some interesting aspects to explore in that. I will be interested to see what happens in Alberta during their next inaugurals, to see what happens. But that we also had 6 out of 177 that had prayer in their regular council meetings. So again, 6, 7 tends to be a relatively similar number. Going to Manitoba, we had 6 out of 110, again, in their 2022 in their 2018 inaugurals, and only 4 out of 101 in their regular council meetings. And the big outlier so far, other than PEI sort of having fewer prayers, is Ontario. Ontario in 2022, we found was 156 prayers. Sorry, 2018, 156 prayers in their inaugurals, and 9 out of 360 in the regular council meetings. The number's gone down. In our last review, we found, I think, about 76, 74. We're still finishing that report up, which is very reassuring, but it's also a lot of municipalities that are violating the Constitution that should know better. So we're hoping that we can really engage with those municipalities in a constructive way. But to me, I think this underscores a couple of things, just to sum up, which is the work of the BC Humanist Association is having a dramatic impact across the country. Often this seems small and performative, but really, when we talk about unconstitutional prayer, the way that a municipal government approaches its governance and the way that it approaches its duty of religious neutrality makes a difference, not just in who feels welcome in council meetings, but also critically in how they spend tax money, how land use planning is done, and a whole host of other things. A municipality that's going to carve out special time for one faith tradition over others is also a municipality that may give special tax privileges to one group over another, that might give special land use planning regulation changes to one group as opposed to another. And so this all kind of filters through. In the case of Saguenay, we have a very clear Supreme Court ruling that says you cannot do this thing. And we have very clear, obvious cases of some municipalities doing that thing. And so we're able to very effectively change their behavior. Whereas some of the other issues that we work on require a more multivariate approach. Changing tax policy is a more complicated process, and we'll do some more videos on that, I'm sure, in the future. So that was kind of my main takeaway, is that we're having an impact, but also we need to stay vigilant. Just because there's a Supreme Court ruling saying that this practice is unconstitutional doesn't mean that that practice isn't going to just discontinued overnight. That practice can continue, and it's a harmful practice, and it's one that we need to be vigilant on. So the work that our team is doing is really important. And if people are interested in getting involved, please contact us to sign up as volunteers. We have a whole wide range of volunteering opportunities. And similarly, if you can't volunteer, but you want to support our work another way, like and subscribe, sign up for our newsletters, but also consider donating. We are a charitable organization that works thanks to the donations of members and supporters. And I think we punch well above our weight, Ian, but we need your support to do that. So we're always going to end with a little bit of a plug before we go to any questions.
Yeah, thanks. You covered everything I would need to do. All the links to donate and join and get involved are on our website, bchumanist.ca. I see one question. Can I elaborate on not needing to use land acknowledgement since I'm not, quote, using the land? Please clarify. Great
Ah,
talk.
yes.
And honestly, it's a big question, and I kind of threw that line away. We are working right now with an Indigenous historian, Robert Jago, who, like us, has a lot of interest in these kind of questions around, um, w- you know, performative elements and reconciliation and where is the right line. And so we've always been trying to wrap our heads around what differentiates religious practices from territorial acknowledgements, because there is a sense there. And one of our first reports after we started looking at prayers in the BC legislature was decolonizing legislative prayer, where we looked at the Indigenous practices in the BC legislature, which included a number of different MLAs starting to use land acknowledgements or Indigenous language in their prayers came up a few times. And something was different about that practice, especially at municipal council meetings, than a religious prayer. And if you trace the history of religious prayer, it was about dominance, it was about proselytization and conformity. It was brought in during the era of the British Church of England trying to push out the Catholics and say, no, this is what we all believe now. So we're going to open, government meetings this way. Indigenous practices, as Robert Jago has talked to me about, and we're hoping to publish this very soon, are more protocol diplomatic
Mhm.
elements. So the territorial acknowledgements within the Coast Salish nations were often, hey, I have arrived on this land. So you say, hi, I am Ian. I am a guest on on the traditional territories of the Coquitlam Nation. I am here to talk to you today about this. And you are kind of asking to use their land. So if I am hosting an event in a park outside my house or something like that, it's kind of I'm declaring that I'm here. Historically, that might have been, I am coming to the Musqueam territories to pick some berries because you have some great fruit bushes. And generally you were permitted to because it was a sharing culture. If you didn't, they might kill you historically. And these are what Jago has told me. So he's talked in some of the talks he's done around this as he's thinking through this, that it doesn't always make sense if you are not physically using resources or land or territory to do this practice, at least within the Coast Salish political protocols. Now, there is kind of a new zeitgeist of, progressive performativism that can be useful for saying it. And, I'm happy to say I'm on the Coquitlam territories, as you talked about yours as well, Teale. But that's where that comes from. And we will have that report soon.
And just to build on that, just like I was talking to a friend of mine who is was our goalie on our hockey team in his First Nations, but from a different community, and he was telling me that yes, when he goes salmon fishing salmon in Goldstream, he'll walk up to a camp and go through the formal protocol. It's incredible. It's not just like a historical thing. This is something that people use to this day, where he would say, "Hi, this is my name. Here's where I come from. Here's my people, and I am here to do X." And that's basically a way of declaring your intentions. It's quite protocol heavy. So yeah, your point, Ian, which is like if if we're in two different digital spaces and we're not using the land for the purposes of our meeting, it sometimes can be seen as a bit too performative. But at the same time, that it has an important element. I do want to note too that a lot of these elements, the protocols and things come from, the protocols that we use in politics often come from indigenous origins. One of my favorite examples is in diplomacy. A lot of the performative elements of diplomatic protocols are drawn from the Iroquois Confederacy, where you have six or seven, depending on when we're talking about different elements of Iroquois, engaging in complicated diplomatic protocols, exchanging wampum, and they would meet at the forest's edge in these very protocol heavy practices because someone's approaching your village from the forest. You don't know if they have negative intent, or they're there to trade, or they're there to access resources, or they're just passing through. And so you'd have these protocols to establish what you're doing there. And it's very, very important, and it's part of diplomacy. But yeah, it does seem a bit like, as Ian was mentioning, it does seem a little bit strange when you're in like a digital space, not using resources and in two different areas. It's more of like, here's who I am and where I am located, but there's less of that kind of declaring to other folks what you're doing with the land. But there's a really wait for the stuff from our report. It's going to be really fascinating, and I think one thing I'd underscore with that, of course, is that First Nations folks are not hegemonic, homogenous. That is, so there's different practices across different cultures, and so what maybe works for the Wasanic peoples and the Iroquois people may not work for different folks from different communities. Say some of our First Nations friends in the prairies, even up the island or wherever. So there's different practices and protocols, and that's why it's critical if you're a local government to reach out to your local community and ask them what they would do as an appropriate way of opening a meeting. It might be a smudging ceremony, it might be drumming, it might be different protocols, and that's important to engage with. It's also important to note that you may have multiple First Nations communities. Here in Saanich, we have multiple communities: the Esquimalt nations, the Saanich nations, and a bunch of other ones. And so we wouldn't maybe just do one protocol; we might do multiple protocols based on different communities and their input. It really is a conversation. It is relationship building. And so our hope is that when you're a local government or higher levels of government, that you're engaging with your local First Nations communities to find out the best, most appropriate way of opening a meeting, doing that thing, and then building constructive relationships moving forward. Great question, though, by the way. That's fantastic. And we've spilled a lot of ink on this, and we'll spill some more on it. It's part of an ongoing process.
And we'll get a live stream on that report or a webinar or something. We're going to try to make sure that it's not just a PDF on our website, but a living conversation we can
And
have.
we've both seen previews, and it is a very, very fascinating report, and like it's going to be really cool to read about. Because I think a lot of times we just do things and we don't know the histories of them, and these practices are rich and connected to real practices that continue to this day that are really important.
So with that, I'm going to close the live stream now. Thank you for all joining us, and I hope more people are able to watch this as we can share and keep these conversations going. So until next
Thanks
time,
so much.
bye. End.
Hey, that was great.
I 11 views.